March 12, 1942. RAF Pembrey, Wales. The fighter sitting on the runway did not belong there. Its wide-track landing gear, blunt nose, and radial engine marked it instantly as German. The black crosses had been hastily painted over, replaced with crude RAF roundels that looked almost apologetic on the aircraft's gray skin. Squadron leader Bernard Schidhauer stood beside it, helmet tucked under his arm, studying the machine in silence. 9 months earlier, this aircraft had been the Luftwaffe's deadliest secret. Now it was British property, captured intact through one of the most improbable navigational mistakes of the war. The Focke-Wulf 190 had arrived in RAF hands not through combat, espionage, or sabotage, but confusion. On a clear June morning in 1942, Oberleutnant Armin Faber had engaged RAF fighters over the Devon coast. After the skirmish, disoriented and low on fuel, he followed what he believed was the English Channel east toward France. It was the Bristol Channel. Faber descended, lined up on what he assumed was a Luftwaffe airfield, and landed smoothly at RAF Pembrey, shutting down his engine before anyone could stop him. British ground crews rushed the aircraft in disbelief. The Phantom that had been slaughtering Spitfire squadrons over France now sat whole and undamaged on Welsh concrete. For months, RAF pilots had known something was wrong. Since late 1941, Spitfire losses over northern France had spiked sharply. Veteran pilots, men who had survived the Battle of Britain, were being shot down with alarming ease. Reports described a new German fighter that attacked faster, rolled harder, and escaped dives no Spitfire could follow. Pilots called it the Butcher Bird. No one knew what it was, only that it was killing them. Now it had a name and a serial number. The evaluation began immediately. Schidhauer climbed into the cockpit, noting details that sent chills through RAF command. The canopy offered near-perfect visibility. The cockpit layout was clean, efficient, built for combat, not comfort. Most shocking was the single-engine control lever. Throttle, propeller pitch, mixture, and supercharger, all automated. The German pilot could focus entirely on fighting, while British pilots wrestled with multiple controls under stress. The engine test followed. The BMW Radial produced more power than the Spitfire Mk V's Merlin, and delivered it with brutal acceleration. In test flights, the 190 proved faster at every altitude above 10,000 feet. Its roll rate was devastating, allowing it to reverse direction before a Spitfire pilot could even react. In a dive, the gap widened further. Where Spitfires shuddered and threatened structural failure, the 190 remained solid and controllable. The numbers were unforgiving. At 20,000 feet, the German fighter was over 25 miles per hour faster. It climbed quicker. It dived harder. Its armament, 4 20mm cannons and machine guns, could destroy a Spitfire in a single short burst. Test pilot Eric Brown's report was concise and damning. This aircraft represents a complete tactical overmatch. In combat, the Spitfire survives only by turning tightly at low speed. Any other maneuver results in destruction. RAF leadership convened an emergency session. For 2 years, British fighter doctrine had been built on one assumption, that the Spitfire was superior. Training, tactics, morale, all of it rested on that belief. The captured Focke-Wulf destroyed it overnight. Loss reports suddenly made sense. Between January and June 1942, Fighter Command had lost more than 3 Spitfires for every German fighter destroyed over France. It wasn't pilot skill. It wasn't courage. It was mathematics. The enemy had leapfrogged them. Wing commanders who had taught aggressive vertical combat now realized they had been sending men to die using outdated logic. Tactics designed for Messerschmitts were useless against this machine. One senior officer summarized it bluntly. "We have been fighting the last war with yesterday's assumptions." As the captured fighter was disassembled bolt by bolt, a grim understanding settled in. The Luftwaffe had not simply built a better aircraft. They had built a system designed for efficiency, durability, and pilot survival. And unless the RAF adapted immediately, the skies over Europe would belong to Germany. The shock did not stay confined to test reports and briefing rooms. It spread through fighter command like a cold front. Squadrons returning from France compared notes and realized how close many of them had come to dying without ever understanding why. Pilots who had survived multiple tours suddenly grasped that luck, not tactics, had kept them alive. The enemy aircraft they had dismissed as just another German variant had been superior in nearly every measurable way. Morale dipped sharply. Squadron leaders struggled to reassure men who now knew the truth. If a Focke-Wulf 190 chose to fight, it could dictate the engagement. If it chose to leave, nothing they flew could stop it. The RAF's response was ruthless and immediate. New combat instructions were issued with unprecedented bluntness. The opening line canceled all previous guidance on engaging German fighters. Pilots were told never to fight a Focke-Wulf on its terms. Vertical maneuvers were forbidden. High-altitude engagements were discouraged. Any Spitfire caught without advantage was ordered to disengage immediately, even if that meant abandoning bombers or breaking formation. It went against everything RAF culture had preached since 1940. Turning away from a fight had once been unthinkable. Now it was doctrine. Training units rewrote their syllabi in weeks. New pilots spent hours studying silhouettes of the 190 from every angle. They practiced one maneuver above all others: the tight, continuous turn at low speed, the single arena where the German fighter was weakest. They were drilled to recognize losing battles early and escape before the 190 could exploit its acceleration. Veterans struggled most with the change. Many had built their identities around aggressive, dominating tactics. Accepting inferiority required swallowing pride. But the casualty lists forced compliance. Survival mattered more than heroics. The captured aircraft also revealed unexpected strategic opportunities. Its limited range meant it could not loiter. German fighters had only minutes to fight before fuel forced them home. RAF planners began designing operations that dragged enemy aircraft toward the edges of their endurance. Fuel, once a limitation, became a weapon. Meanwhile, British engineers raced to close the gap. The Spitfire Mk V, rushed into service almost recklessly, was built specifically to counter the Focke-Wulf. Its two-stage supercharged engine restored altitude performance and gave RAF pilots a fighting chance above 20,000 feet. Other aircraft were reassigned roles entirely. Fighters that could not compete were pushed into ground attack, where speed and roll rate mattered less than durability. Behind the scenes, industrial priorities shifted. Production numbers were sacrificed for capability. Advanced variants jumped ahead of simpler models. The RAF accepted fewer aircraft if they were better ones. The lesson was harsh but clear. Quantity without parity was just another way to lose men faster. The human cost of the delay was staggering. Hundreds of experienced pilots, men who had survived the Battle of Britain, were gone by the time new tactics filtered through the squadrons. Many had been killed before anyone knew the rules had changed. Survivors spoke of encounters that ended before they understood they were under attack. One burst, one pass, and fire. The sound of the German radial engine became infamous. Pilots described it as a metallic snarl, different from anything else in the sky. Hearing it above them triggered instant fear, not panic, but certainty. You knew the enemy held the advantage. Yet something else began to change. As knowledge replaced mystery, fear softened into calculation. The Focke-Wulf was no longer an unknown predator. It was dangerous, but it had limits. Pilots learned when it could be beaten, when it must be avoided, and when survival meant retreat. The RAF had lost its illusion of superiority, but gained something else in its place: professional realism. By late 1942, Fighter Command no longer believed in invincibility. It believed in preparation, intelligence, and adaptation. Operations became deliberate, layered, and cautious. Pride was replaced by math. And that transformation, forced by one captured aircraft, would ultimately save far more lives than it had cost. The reckoning came slowly, then all at once. As 1943 unfolded, the RAF no longer chased dominance through bravado. It pursued it through systems. Every mission was planned around probabilities: where German fighters could appear, how long they could remain, what altitude favored which aircraft, and when withdrawal was the correct decision rather than a failure of nerve. The final, critical insight from testing the captured Focke-Wulf emerged months later, and it changed everything. At very high speeds, the aircraft that had terrorized RAF pilots revealed a flaw. Above roughly 350 miles per hour, the Focke-Wulf's famed roll rate deteriorated sharply. At extreme dive speeds, Its ailerons stiffened so badly that rapid maneuvering became nearly impossible. The same characteristic that made it lethal in close combat became a liability at the edge of its performance envelope. New escape tactics followed. Spitfire pilots were trained to force head-on approaches, then dive away at maximum speed. In these high-velocity descents, the German fighter could not roll quickly enough to follow. Survival no longer depended on winning. It depended on reaching a speed where physics favored escape. By the end of 1942, RAF fighter operations bore little resemblance to those of 2 years earlier. The romantic idea of the lone ace had vanished. In its place stood layered formations, altitude blocks, and rigid coordination. Air combat had become industrialized. The price of learning had been enormous. Hundreds of pilots died before the truth was understood. Many were veterans whose experience could never be replaced. Loss reports forced a brutal conclusion. Complacency had killed them as surely as enemy fire. Yet adaptation worked. The arrival of improved Allied aircraft, particularly long-range American fighters, finally reversed the balance. Aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt and, later, the P-51 Mustang brought endurance, firepower, and altitude performance the Luftwaffe could not match. The Focke-Wulf, once dominant, found itself defending German skies against overwhelming numbers. The hunter became the hunted. Its limited range, once irrelevant, became fatal. It could no longer choose when to fight. Allied escorts stayed with bombers deep into the Reich, turning interception into attrition the Luftwaffe could not afford. The lessons extended far beyond tactics. British aircraft design philosophy changed permanently. Elegance gave way to ruggedness. Simplicity replaced craftsmanship. Pilot workload became a priority. Engines were chosen for survivability as much as performance. Aircraft became systems, not sculptures. Training transformed as well. Pilots were taught that superiority was temporary, that every enemy could evolve, and that survival depended on understanding, not assuming, advantage. Doctrine emphasized intelligence, flexibility, and restraint. Knowing when not to fight became as important as knowing how. The captured Focke-Wulf itself became a traveling classroom. Pilots walked around it in silence, touching the rivets, studying the engine mounts, peering into the cockpit. It was no longer a symbol of fear, but of humility, proof that victory bred blindness if left unchallenged. Historians would later conclude that the accidental landing of that single aircraft saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Allied airmen. Not because it revealed German strength, but because it forced the RAF to confront its own dangerous assumptions. In war, ignorance kills faster than bullets. By 1944, the RAF was no longer fighting with illusions. It fought with preparation, numbers, intelligence, and adaptability. The transformation that began on a Welsh runway reshaped the Allied air war and ensured that technical surprise would never again go unanswered. The Focke-Wulf 190's greatest legacy was not its victories, but the discipline it imposed on those who faced it. In the mathematics of warfare, learning in time is everything. And this time, the lesson arrived just soon enough.